Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
This
How are you today?
this is where I pretend I wasn't speaking to you five
Yeah.
minutes ago. Um, it's great. Thank you very much, everybody that's joining us. So myself and Alex done a poll in the wake of the Harmon Phoenix spectacular, and we asked people what they'd like to hear about next. And the single biggest thing people wanted to hear us talk about was the C-41 process. So I think some of that might stem from people that develop their own film are a bit kind of worried about the process or how it's
Yep.
different from the black and white side of it. Or maybe it's a thing of they're sending their film out to the labs and thinking maybe I should do this themselves. So we're hoping, and we'd encourage you to ask questions as we go along. There's a pile of stuff here. I suppose, Alex, I think we're going to take the form of me asking you some questions and then you just
Yeah, and then
not
have some
stop
back and
talking
forth,
until I
I guess.
interrupt you. Yeah.
Yeah, and everyone who's watching, feel free to just drop a question in whenever, and it might be something that's already been sent in advance, or it might be something completely, that we're not completely prepared for, not that we're super prepared for this. I have some basic notes, but nothing crazy. Yeah, so just let us know what you want to know. That's what we're here for.
So, I suppose, Alex, first of all, what is C-41? Like, just on the most basic side of it, what's the difference?
So C-41 is the code name for Kodak's version of the color negative development process for print film. That's your typical orange negatives that you would get from your family photos if they weren't slides back in the day. Your standard color film nowadays. I think it's called CN16 in Japan. You'll see that in some packaging. It'll say C-41 slash. I think it's CN16, and that would be Fujifilm's version of the process. But everyone pretty much has adopted the C-41 name, and it's just a standard process to develop any regular color negative film that's called a print film. So excluding things like cinema films and slide films.
Okay, and it's a standard process. So my understanding of this is, no matter how you're doing this, in theory, the starting point is if it's color negative film, it's C-41 process, and it's the same steps.
Yeah. So unlike black and white film, there is only a single developing agent for color negative film, for print film. It's called CD4, and I don't want to go into too much of the chemistry, the depths of it here. Um, the actual developing agent is the same for any color film, and they are designed to be used with that developing agent. So there is a single process built around it, where with black and white film, you could have 10 to 20 different developing agents, hydroquinone, catechol, methyl, blah, 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 that all do slightly different things and will still get you the results. But the only correct developer or developing agent for color negative film, for print film, is CD4. So there's only one process. So every film is designed around that one process with their film speeds and their contrast and everything tuned to a very specific development time, both for consistency and a bit of chemical necessity, but also for convenience because it means your labs can take these films and just develop them all at the same time. This is a roll of Portra 800 and 800 speed color negative film, and I developed that at the exact same time as a roll of Kodak Ektar, which is a 100 speed film.
Okay, so from the lab's point of view, everything's standardized, put it into the machine.
Yeah, if it
It's
says
it,
C-41 on the can, it goes in for the normal amount of time and you get fantastic results, hopefully.
okay. Yeah, hopefully. And is this one of the reasons why you would look at doing this at home yourself, so that you have some control around, say, the pushing and pulling of film speeds like you would with black and white? Like,
Yeah,
is
so
that
for me,
possible with
with
the
color
color
negative
side of it?
film, absolutely. So just like with black and white film, you can push or pull the film. So pushing is where you underexpose the film by rating it at a higher ISO, you give it less light, and then you develop it for longer to compensate for this. And then pulling is where you overexpose the film, you treat it as lower ISO, and then you underdevelop it to compensate for that. So I think my phone is slipping downwards slightly. Um, and you can still do that with color negative development. I would say your scope is a bit narrower because the development time is quite short. Standard black and white film tends to be in sort of 5 to 10 minute range for most developers. C-41 standard development is 3 minutes and 15 seconds. So if you start taking 30-50% off of that, you start to get into very short development times very quickly, and uneven development becomes a problem. So pulling has certainly a much more limited range with color negative film. But honestly, color negative films nowadays can handle overexposure so well that you can, people rate Portra 400 at 200 all the time. You can
Well,
just do that and
that's
not adjust the development. You don't need to. The film has an incredible tolerance for over and
you're just
underexposure.
doing that for the
For
tones, though.
the tones would be the least. Yeah.
So with the one of the things that I get asked about, because I would deal with a lot of people that are already developing their own black and white stuff quite routinely, and one of the things that people get really caught up on is the slightly higher temperature. So black and white assume generally about 20 degrees Celsius, and for our American friends that's 20 degrees Celsius. Um, so with the C-41 side of it, you're up around the 38 degrees, and I know for an awful lot of people that are kind of nervous about this, it's that temperature side of it. Now, I know when we done the Harman video live stream a few weeks back, we kind of touched on this a little bit, and one of the questions a lot of people asked was how important is the temperature side of it?
So the official spec, I believe, there's an incredibly long document that defines what C-41 is from Kodak, and I think it's 45, 50 pages long, and that will break down the incredible nitty-gritty of absolutely everything, especially on industrial scale processing. But one of the things they say is around 0.3 degrees plus or minus, so 37.7 to 38.3 degrees Celsius would be your tolerance at the absolute most. But for technically perfect results, you want to be at 38 degrees. When it comes to home processing, if you're not RA4 printing in the darkroom, which developing in the darkroom is relatively niche within film nowadays. Not many people have access to a darkroom. People who print RA4 are a very rare breed. I only know 2 or 3 people like Mark Murray who actually do this on a semi-regular basis. If you're not RA4 printing, these slight variations in the results that you'll get by developing at a higher or lower temperature are just going to disappear when you scan the film. It's like, one way I think of it is if you slightly over or undercook your dinner, you can just make up for that in a certain way with a bit of sauce or a bit of seasoning, something like that. If you cook it a bit too long and it's a bit too dry, you can add some sauce to stop it going, moisten it back up a bit. You kind of do the same thing. If your film is developed at slightly too lower temperature and it goes a bit teal or cyan, you can just go in the opposite direction and add a bit of red in when you scan. Or if you're using, an automated scanner like a Epson V600 flatbed down there, the scanner will do that automatically, and chances are you won't even notice that you're correcting for this minor difference. I mean, how many people are using step wedges to measure their black and white development? Very, very few. Certainly, people aren't using control strips for color film. It's
and even on the, just to not upset the few people that I do know that RA4 print, that even that thing where your dev has you lean towards your cyan or your magenta, once you dial that in on the filters on the enlarger, you kind of take care of that the same way you're taking care of it with the scanning. So while it's the same scenario, the temperature is kind of important, but it's like with all of this, it's like the closer you can get it to correct means you're going to have to mess about with it an awful lot less in post, whether that's a scan or an RA4 print is kind of, would be my take on it. But people get very hung up on this, and they think that it will be next to impossible to do this at home because of that difference between the 20 and the 38.
And that's completely fair. So one of the easiest ways that you can work around this is, and of course you can heat the water in any number of different ways. I know people who just boil up a bunch of water in a kettle or something. They use like an aquarium heater. People use sous vides and various different things. I have a Jobo TDE2 on the floor. It's basically a glorified heated water bath. I think most people are familiar with the concept of inertia, right? A train has a lot tougher of a time to stop than a car does because it weighs hundreds of thousands of tons compared to a car which probably weighs 2. There's a similar concept in heat called thermal mass, which is essentially temperature. The more stuff you have, the easier it is for it to keep temperature. People might be familiar with the idea that a full fridge is cheaper to run than a half-empty fridge because you've got more stuff in there. It keeps the temperature more stable. So if you have a big tub of water, like a 10-liter bucket or something, and you float your bottles of developer and bleach and everything in there to warm them up, they're going to keep their temperature a lot better than if you heat them up in just a really small tank. In theory, something like a bath would be not ideal, but it would, give you an even greater effect. So the more water you can heat up, the slower it's going to lose heat, meaning the more stable your temperature will be. And that's the simplest way to work around this. Another way is, if you're concerned, you can just slightly overshoot the temperature to start. I know some people who will aim for 38 degrees, but actually heat their developer to like 39. So if it does cool down a bit, it might go to 37, and it kind of averages out over the 3 minutes. And that's another thing, because the development time is so short at 3 to 3.5 minutes, for freshish chemicals, there's not a lot of time to lose that much heat. So it doesn't become that much of an issue. It's not like we're doing an hour-long developer and you're going to be going down from 38 degrees to 20 unless you're very, very careful.
Yeah. There's people in there mentioning things like the Cinestill heater or sous vides or that type of thing. You have a Jobo, which is a very fancy way of doing it. When I started doing my own C-41, it was a basin, and I was very much on the overheat the thermal mass, my bath that all the bottles went into. So the chemistry was up to temperature, and then the bath was in, and then all of the bottles sat in one container.
Yeah.
I'm more sophisticated with it now, but that's a whole other it's you can go further with this, and then in terms of the actual kit that you're using, it's more or less the same as what you're using for your black and white dev. It's reels and tanks and
so for most people it's going to be standard Patterson reels, Patterson tanks, or whatever your preference is. Most people are using Patterson stuff. There are two ways, or two parameters that differ between color development kits, realistically. So you've got powder kits versus liquid kits. There are only a couple of powder kits on the market, so that's where the different chemicals come as sachets of powders that you will then dissolve to make up your stock solution, exactly like the Cinestill CS Simplified kit. The Cinestill kit, I believe, is available as both a powder and a liquid kit. And then most kits on the market are available as liquid concentrates that you then add water to dilute them down to the appropriate size, usually 1 liter, sometimes 4 or 5 liters. The other way that the different kits differ, and this is the bigger way in my opinion, because that only matters when you're mixing up the stocks to begin with, is whether it's a 2-bath kit or a 3-bath kit. So with your black and white development, which I imagine a good few people watching this are familiar with if they're looking into home C-41, is you will develop the film, usually have some kind of a stop bath, be that water or a dedicated stop, and then a fixer to remove the unexposed materials from the film to fix it and make it insensitive to light and safe to actually handle. With color film, you have a developer, then you have a bleach. Because of the nature of the way color film works, you're still using silver as a means to make the color dyes, I'll say, without having a PowerPoint and boring people. That's kind of probably where I'll leave it. You need to bleach the metallic silver that you form so that the fixer can then strip it away along with all of the unexposed silver. So you have, instead of developer, maybe stop and fix, developer and fix at the absolute minimum, you have developer, bleach, and fix. And a lot of kits will combine the bleach and fixer into a single step called a blix or bleach fix, usually called blix just for obvious reasons. And then you have to basically decide whether you want a 2-bath or a 3-bath kit. In most cases, it works out to about the same time. So for the Rollei Color Chem C-41 kit, the blix time, is 6 minutes when the kit is new. And then for the Fuji Hunt Express C-41 kit, it's 6.5 minutes for bleach and 6.5 minutes for fix, so quite a bit longer. But the blix kits, across the board, the blix time gets very, very long as you reuse it. So something we haven't mentioned yet is that most black and white developers, most of them, especially when you factor in the different dilutions, are used one shot. You use it, you throw it away. It's only things like stock Xtol and stock D76 and the like that you actually do reuse. If you're diluting Rodinol, diluting your D76 or T-Max Dev, anything like that, you throw it away after one use. C-41 chemicals, they'll have a number of roles they're rated for on the box, and you reuse them over and over with extended time to compensate for the developer getting weaker. Same thing with the bleach, fix, or blix.
And that's just to touch on, Alex, that's by virtue of every time you use the developer, you're weakening it you've the leftovers of what was in the previous roll, kind of diminishing the power
Yeah, so your starting
of the development.
solution has more than enough chemical developing power or bleaching or fixing power to develop or bleach or fix a single roll of film. But there's a ton of capacity left in there, of power left in there. And once it's being used, it's just a little bit more dilute because you've taken away a bit of the good stuff out of it. So you do have to use a slightly longer time, and the exact method of temperature or time compensation for the aging of the chemicals and its reuse does vary between manufacturers. Some give you tables, some give you percentages that you just have to work out yourself. But broadly speaking, you extend the development time a little bit to compensate for the weakening of the chemicals, yeah, until they reach their kind of end of life.
Yeah.
But with the Blix kits, rather than bleach and fix, which tend to stay near enough around the same time through their capacity, Blix times get very, very long, which is one of the reasons I'm not personally a fan of them. So for all of the kits I've seen with Blixes, by the time you get to your 12th-ish roll, you're looking at 15 minutes just for that one step. So even though the development is very fast at 3 minutes, 15 seconds to 4 minutes when the chems are older, the Blix gets quite, lengthy and quite boring, to be honest.
Yeah.
So I personally prefer using 3 bath kits because even though it's another step, you're doing developer, bleach, and then fix separately, it does save a lot of time, especially when you have a lot of film to develop in one session.
And I mean, it's probably, if we're just giving people sort of a basic go through this. The other thing about the separate bleach and fix thing, I don't do a whole pile of it anymore, but I used to. I don't know, a few years ago, I was utterly obsessed with bleach bypassing
Mm.
nearly everything. I think it was at the time my worldview made the whole thing look like an apocalyptic wasteland, and it just, some of the films, it suited that. So that's one of the reasons I always veered more towards the kits I was using was the Tetnol and the Fuji Hunt at the time. So they were separate steps anyway, but I used to just do the bleach bypass. So from the creative side of it, it's an
Yeah,
awful lot more along the lines of the reason I do all this stuff myself is the creative control behind it, or at least you're making the choices, you know. Um,
Yeah,
and
I
on
mean, there's
the
a similar argument to be made there with the idea of, buying really fresh, high quality vegetables versus processed whatever. And I forget the health aspect. It might be more expensive to buy the fresh, high quality veg at a good veg shop, but you have a lot more control in what you can do with it. And it's the same kind of idea here. The less that's kind of predefined and decided by somebody else for you, the more decisions you could make at home, which which gives you more potential value in doing this compared to sending your film to a lab.
on on the value side of it, the lifespan of these kits as well, or the stated number of rolls. Because I get on the commercial side of this, I get an awful lot of questions around that because, well, mostly because I sell a load of different versions of the what effectively is the same thing, and I
Yeah.
get questions around the Bellini versus the Cine kits and kind of the life expectancy of them, or the amount of rolls you would expect to get out of the kits. Have you something on that in terms of the how many rolls you actually get out of a kit? Because I know in that Discord group that we're in, Tom, the guy called Tom in there used to, like, it was, I'm up to my 40th roll in the one kit, and it's like, this stuff is madness. But
Yeah, so I think of the capacity of a kit as something like using tools, like sharp tools in any kind of a work environment. So, say for example, the Fujifilm Hunt Express C-41 kit per liter, it's rated for 16 rolls of standard 36 exposure 35mm film. That's per liter. Whereas the say Bellini kit is rated for 16, same number of rolls of 24 exposure 36 or 35 film. So that's about 11 rolls of 36 exposures instead of 16. So what you would say that the Bellini has 5 rolls less capacity per liter in the same kit. And for example, even Cinestill in their own instructions, they tell you up to 24 rolls, but in the instructions they specifically actually only say 8 rolls. And this is because we're talking about optimum best results. And like we said with the temperature, if you want fantastic, brilliant results with minimal effort needed in either RA4 printing or scanning, it's better to use fresh chems that haven't been used and aren't old. because as the chemicals get reused, either because they get weaker or stuff kind of builds up in the film, they just age and they don't perform as well. So it will develop your film, but you won't get the best quality negatives out of it. So when you see a capacity on these kits, they're not saying you can only develop 16 rolls. They're saying you can develop up to 16 rolls with the best possible results, assuming you do everything properly. You can develop more film than that, but the results will start to get worse and worse. And, how quickly they get worse depends on the kit. There is some variance from brand to brand, but taking the Bellini kit as an example, I find the decline to be quite slow. The most I've done out of one kit is 18 rolls because, and this is something you and I have spoken about before, the film is the expensive part here. When for color negative film, you're talking 15 to 20 euros a roll for a good roll of film. I don't really care if I get one roll less out of my 30, 40 euro kit.
Yes.
If it means I'm actually going to be able to develop that roll and get the pictures out at the end, I don't mind spending an extra euro, implicitly to replace the developer a little bit sooner.
I know there was, for an awful lot of this, because you see this, like you see this on forums, and you're constantly getting the question of like, I bought this HC110 in 1976. Is it still good? And I was like, you're developing a roll of Delta 100 in this. The roll of film is definitely worth more than the developer you're going to bin. And it's the same with the kits. It's like, I'm all for the economies of this stuff, and I really enjoy kind of reading some of the stuff about how far people push this. Am I doing it with my own film? No. I'm kind of I kind of move on past it,
Yeah. Just to go back to the sharpness analogy, because I didn't really finish that. If you imagine we live in a world where sharpening tools is not possible, say you're a woodworker and you're using a chisel every day. Every time you use it, it gets a little bit more dull and it takes a bit more effort to get good results with it. You have to push it a bit harder. Maybe every now and then you get a nick somewhere that you weren't planning on. In that theoretical world where you have to sharpen the chisel, at a certain point, you're going to stop getting good results and it becomes more effort than it's worth to just replace it and buy a new chisel. Yeah. And that's ultimately what we're talking about here. As for the capacity, the shelf life, the concentrates and powders tend to last quite a long time, several months for the liquid concentrates and much longer for the powders because they're not dissolved in water. They're not being constantly exposed to oxygen in the same way. Once you mix the chemicals, some people go to extremes and buy dedicated fridges to store their concentrates and their stock solutions in, which I think is a bit much. You're broadly talking within a month at most, you want to be using all of this kit and then chucking it and buying a new one. So most people, when they develop C-41 film at home, will just buy a kit after they've built up a certain number of rolls, maybe 8 rolls, and they might shoot a few more in the coming weeks and then develop the film.
Yeah. That tended to be the way I was doing it. It usually meant you were kind of in for a hellish couple of days of deving, and I know you do this, but there's I very rarely just kind of done a roll or two, because I found, even with my best intentions with this stuff, that either the boredom kicks in or something else, and you kind of go, okay, I've done 5 rolls now, I'll definitely come back to this next Saturday, and then it's like, so there is the benefit of kind of sending it out to the lab if you're doing one roll at a time, because
of course, especially when you're talking about the short shelf life.
Yeah, if you're spending 50 quid on a kit to do one roll, there's better ways of doing it.
Sorry, we have a question in the chat I want to get to. JBlack760 has asked if it's okay to use C-41 developer with E6 film. Yes and no. If you want it to look anything like the film is supposed to look, the answer is absolutely not. That is called cross-processing, where you develop a film in the wrong process. You're crossing it over into a different chemical process. In the case of E6 film developed in C-41, you're going to see very coarse grain, very high contrast, and wild color shifts that generally don't look very good. Velvia tends to go very like neon green. Ektachrome can go sort of a bluish green, and in my opinion, doesn't look very good. Provia, I'm not so sure. I haven't shot any and developed it in C-41, but there are tons of examples, especially on the Lomography blog, and they're like gallery, because cross-processing is part of the Lomo vibe, and there are tons of results with different films out there. The last thing I'll say very quickly on that is, if you shoot slide film for C-41 processing, you need to rate it at 2 stops higher of an ISO. So if you're shooting Ektachrome and you want to develop it in C-41, you should be shooting it at 400 rather than 100. The reason why is a bit lengthy to explain, so I'll just trust me on that.
Is it hard? Is it difficult to do, Alex? C-41 developing?
No, it's exactly the same as black and white. I think the only thing that's vaguely stressful is if you were doing it in a very large tank, like a 5 reel or an 8 reel Patterson tank, where you're talking about 2 to 3 liters capacity, then it takes a long time to fill the tank. You could be 20, 30 seconds filling the tank, depending on, the shape of your funnel and the type of jug that you're using, which can actually contribute a significant amount of time in your 3 minutes. And that could lead to some uneven development, the bottom roll in the tank versus the top roll. When it comes to very large tanks, if you're talking about large batch processing like that, you're going to be looking at rotary processing a lot of the time with something like Diago. And I see the folks from Vintage Visual are watching this video. So Diago, Jobo, and other processors are able to hold, this isn't a tank, it's just a bottle, hold the tank sideways and constantly rotate it. You've your Argo there, perfect. And it will start rotating the reels inside the tank, whichever kind of machine it is, while you're pouring the developer in. So it's constantly kind of starting the development with every roll at roughly the same time. Diego asks what agitation is like. Is it the same as with black and white developing, or more often since the time is so short? Yeah, so there are instructions in every kit. The usual rule of thumb is 10 to 15 seconds of constant agitation, and then 2 agitations or inversions every 30 seconds.
Yeah.
I think it's 30 seconds after that. But an important note there is if people are looking into things like rotary processing, the time, for reasons I have been completely unable to find any technical documentation for, are exactly the same whether you do standard handheld, inversion processing or rotary processing with C-41, unlike black and white where the times are quite different.
This is one of the things around where I try and encourage people not to get too hung up about this, Alex, because those two numbers cannot be the same.
No.
Because the constant agitation, like certainly with your black and white, if you're not taking your 15 to 20% off it, you're overdeveloping your film,
I don't think we need to get into the nitty gritty here, but trust that if anyone knows about rotary processing and the like it fundamentally doesn't make sense that the different agitation patterns should have the same development time. Chances are that's more for color reasons than density reasons, but I can't actually find any technical documentation on that.
I don't know. So on the essential side of it, tanks, reels, thermometer, I think
tanks, reels, thermometer, storage bottles. So you're probably, a lot of people will measure out, say, like 350 mil or something like that if they're doing one roll at a time for C-41. So then they don't have to measure it out of the jug as they go. They can just pour the whole thing in, put the lid on the tank, and get started. That's fair enough. But you want to store it in something decent. So I use these Rolli type jugs or bottles. I find they're quite good. You can use amber glass bottles as well. It's important to store this stuff in the dark and protect it from oxygen, ideally. If you're using it in like a weekend and you're just burning through the whole kit, you don't really need to worry about that. But if you're going to be storing it for weeks to months, a nice to have would be an oxygen displacing gas, like a butane spray, a protectant type spray, to get rid of the oxygen in the bottle so it doesn't start oxidizing the developer. But yeah, fundamentals: something to put the hot water in, something to heat the water, a tank and reel to actually have the film inside the tank, and a changing bag to be able to load it in. A thermometer, definitely, and that's a good point actually. If you imagine this is in a giant bucket of water, measuring the temperature of the water is not the way to go. You have to measure the temperature of what's inside the bottle, because due to the insulating properties of the plastic, it's decently thermally conductive, but heat will not get into the bottle as quickly as you think. The water will hit 38 degrees a good while before the contents of the bottle do. So it's important to measure the temperature inside the bottle.
On that, when you're doing this, it's as you're measuring your temperature. If you only have one thermometer, which most of us do, it's measure your dev, then your bleach fix, etc.
Yes, that is another thing.
Because if you go the other way, you're diminishing the lifespan of your developer. I mean, it's just good chemical hygiene always with that. But that's a whole. You see that sometimes where people kind of go, I think I've mixed these up, but they'll find that their developer dies a lot quicker than their bleach or fix, and this is generally because they're when you're doing a lot of these together, when you're doing a lot of chemicals, you have a lot of bottles on the go, and if you're
Yep.
using the same jugs and everything, you're probably adding way more bleach and fix to your developer and removing some of the lifespan or some of the
Yeah,
potency
or
of it.
even outright killing it.
Yeah,
That's very
yeah,
common as well.
yeah,
You see posts on forums on Reddit or on other sites very often where people post a completely blank roll of film. There's nothing even in the markings and the edges. It won't show up on camera well, but there are like writings and numbers and various notch codes and things on the edges outside of the film, and that will be completely blank as well. And the answer is almost always because they got bleach or Blix into their developer and completely destroyed it.
yes, yeah. Have you anything screaming on your list of questions or the people had asked us beforehand, Alex? You want to make sure you hit.
Nope.
If
Just
if
what's
any
here and what you have.
if anybody is in there and they have a question that's kind of burning in their heart that they want to ask us about this or anything else, please shoot it into the live there. And I think we've kind of covered. I mean, we covered anything that was like screaming at me. What's nice to have is the extra stuff. Why is it standard? People being very hung up on how much more difficult this is than black and white. It really isn't. We've a question there from Oscar about the pre-soaking in 40-degree water help with developer time and temperature.
Funny thing, some kits say you should pre-warm the tank dry, so the empty tank with no water in it for 3 to 5, 10 minutes to allow just the air inside the tank to warm up and slightly warm up the reels a little bit so that the hot developer doesn't cool down as much when it goes inside the tank. Some kits say that you should just use warm water. And other people say that, or other people, Kodak themselves say you should absolutely not pre-soak color film because it might affect the development and cause it to be slightly uneven, cause the gelatin to swell, blah, blah, technical things. So it doesn't really matter, I think. I tend to leave my tanks, again, this is just a bottle, not a Patterson tank. I forgot to bring one up. I leave this in my water bath with the film inside it for about 5-ish minutes before I start and just let it warm up. And that seems to be working out pretty well for me. I've done 120 odd color rolls this year so far. It's been a lot and it seems to work fine, so I'm pretty confident in that not being an issue.
I've tended to never really worry too much about it. For some of my black and white stuff, just because it's a process I do, I tend to pre-soak it because I want the chemistry into the emulsion fairly quick. But that's a whole other thing. Callum T, do you, always do a strip test if your chems have been idle? Absolutely. I forever suggesting to people to do a clip test. And what sort of life are you getting out of the Bellini C-41 kits? I think there's nobody better qualified to answer that, Alex.
I think I'm on what? I mean, you would know, you'd be able to check my account. I'm on my 6th or 7th kit this year. At least. Jesus. So yes, doing a clip test is always a good idea if you're unsure about your chems. What this is you can only really do this with 35mm film. You will cut the leader off before you load it onto your reel anyway, so that it loads on smoothly. And you would just dip this into the developer for whatever the amount of time is. And exposed leader that has been in the light should go pretty much completely black. And then if you dip, say, half of it into your Blix or your bleach, it'll start to go clear, and then your fixer again, and it should clarify it. That won't tell you how well it's going to work, but it will tell you that the chemicals aren't completely dead, which is usually enough. If you're ever in a situation like that and you have multiple rolls, pick which one you're most willing to lose, and then kind of just go with that first. Yeah. Even when I mix up a fresh kit, I always just have a look at what roll I care about least and use that just to make sure I haven't messed up mixing the chemicals or anything, or I've still got it, and then start doing the rest of the film. Yeah. In terms of life, Callum, do you mean shelf life or capacity? I'll start with capacity. The official rating, I have it here, is 1624 exposure rolls, which is about 1136 exposure rolls. I said earlier, the most I've gotten is about 18. Again, that's all 36 exposure rolls out of a kit. And there is some kind of a difference between the rolls. I don't think there's a major difference. Something I personally do, and I think is good advice, of course I do because it's something I do, is to use your kind of weird or expired films, or to push towards the end of the life of the kit. Pushing expired film or strange films like Seagull IR100, Lomography's Lomochrome Purple, any kind of red scale film where the colors aren't going to look right anyway, there's more room for them to not look quite right, if that makes sense. So you want your Portra 400 to look great. So you should do that earlier in the life of the kit. And then, yeah, use the kind of funkier stuff towards the end, where if it does go a bit grungy or crunchy, it's less of a big deal because you weren't expecting normal colors to begin with. In terms of shelf life.
Sorry, Alex. The same with people doing film soup, where they're leaving the rolls of
Yeah.
film in glasses of wine or putting them through the dishwasher. That kind of stuff. That's the arse end of your C-41 kit. Is
Yes,
when they'd
because then
recommend that.
whatever's there will become part of the developer and potentially affect or ruin future rolls, depending on what you actually did that with. I always find I'm out of time rather than exhaustion. So again,
So that's the length of time that you're keeping the kit, Callum, rather than it expiring. Like you have it open and mixed for a couple of months rather than it actually running out. Is this what you're getting at? It's oxidizing over time. Yeah, okay. So with this, it's once you have it mixed up, the actual working solution, if you're keeping it free from oxygen, is a matter of weeks. If it's not mixed, it's months, and if it's still in the box, it's possibly a couple of years.
However, bleach, fix, and Blix are much better at keeping. They last a lot longer than developer does. The developer is really the short-term thing here. I've used bleach and fix from a Bellini kit that were 7 months old because I mixed up 2 bottles and I didn't realize I hadn't gotten rid of that old bleach and fixer, and they still worked perfectly for another half a dozen rolls. I'm seeing oxidization in 4 weeks. Forum bandits saying months from working strength developer. Yeah, like people on forums say a lot of things. A lot of these things are absolutely correct, but the vast majority of people saying kind of nonsense. I mean, it's like someone saying, oh, I got hit by a car once and I was fine. There's no reason you should get hurt. There's a lot of like, I've done this once and it was grand kind of thing, which doesn't really hold up to trends of things. The bleach and fix, yeah, they will last months and months. Not quite ECN2. Yeah, ECN2 developer does not last a long time at all. It's very prone to oxidation. I think personally within 2 weeks I'd be getting rid of it.
ECN mix, shoot your 12 rolls, make your kit, do the whole lot.
Do it in a day if you can. Yeah.
Yeah.
C-41 is much better in that regard, which is one of the reasons it's the newer development process.
Oscar, I use CineStill kit at 10 seconds to development time for every 2 rolls. You do you, bro. I can get up to 20 rolls from 1 liter kit. Is it similar with 1 liter kit from Bellini? Yes. But it's my experience of this is that with the CineStill kit, I have seen sudden death. It works until it doesn't. Whereas the Bellini, when you see some of the crazy stuff that people are doing, and they're really pushing it to the limits of what the kit will do, the Bellini, the Tetnol, and the Fuji Hunt kits and this kind of stuff, you will get very bizarre results around your 30th or 40th roll. It'll color shift, it'll be very grainy.
Yeah.
It'll still develop. The Cine kit, I've seen it just, and this is kind of the thing we were saying about earlier. If a roll of Kodak Gold is costing you 12 or 13 euros, do you really need that 20th roll out?
Yeah, do you really need to save another 50 cents on the developer? Probably not.
But I mean, I've a vested interest in it. I sell it, so what do I know about it?
Yeah, Brendan and I have spoken about this before, especially in the context of black and white development and people overusing their fixer. The memories are worth more than the money.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, especially if you're shooting this for work, then God, do not risk anything. But if you're doing this for yourself, it's important to do it as properly as you can, so that these rolls of film are there 30, 40 years down the line, 100 years down the line, potentially, if you store them well.
Yeah. It was always my take on it. I mean, I used to do it years ago when, it would be just push it until I can get absolutely everything out of the kit. And then I had a couple of times I'd gone and made a special effort to go and shoot stuff that I really wanted and I cared about. And it was like, the chemistry's probably fine. I don't even entertain that anymore. If I forget to write It's different for me. I've sort of ready access to a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
But if I haven't tracked when I've opened something or mixed something, or if I'm dubious about it, I just have reached the point where I just won't risk it.
Yeah.
But that's
Cinestill
not to
actually have very
dissuade.
high standards. They say in the instructions for their kit that you can develop up to 24 rolls, but for best results, it's only 8, which is quite a lot lower than the others. So their standards are very good. And they have, like, I think 3 or 4 paragraphs on the second page of the instructions where they basically say, if you are willing to be the arbiter of your own fate and dive into this, you can judge on a roll by roll basis when you are done. You can keep going until you're not happy with the results anymore. And Brendan and I don't mean to judge people who try and go beyond the official stated limits, especially, let's be real, this stuff is expensive. Shooting film is expensive. And especially if you're a student or just you're in a difficult financial situation and want to shoot color film and do it at home, it can be very tempting to go that way. And do it, try it, and see how you get on with it. But it's worth investing that kind of time and effort to learn where you feel the limit is.
Yeah,
Brendan and
I think
are definitely erring on the cautious side, but we're not saying that you're wrong if you do go in the other direction.
There is a thing, I know the rolls of film do actually say, develop the film shortly after you shoot it, but I think they're talking years there, not days or weeks. So if you're saving up rolls and precious memories and that kind of stuff till you have enough to justify another kit and that kind of thing, it's probably worth hanging on. Kay, considering how economical replenishment is for black and white and lab use, do you think Bellini or other brands offering a replenishable C-41 kit would be a good idea? Bellini released just the developer because people kept telling them that there's twice the amount of life in the bleach and fix than there is in the developer. So you can basically buy the developer separate to the bleach and fix because it will effectively extend the life of the kit by twice. It's not quite replenishment. It isn't. In the
So
same
just
way
very
that black and
quickly
white
for anyone
is,
who doesn't know, replenishment is you use your stock solution of a very concentrated developer and you toss a tiny portion of it away, and then you'll top it up with a little bit of fresh solution. So you might use 1 liter, throw away 50 milliliters or something like that, and add in 50 fresh milliliters. So overall, you end up with a kind of what they call a seasoned solution after a few rolls, where it's not quite old, but it's not quite new either. And that gives a good balance for certain black and white developers, Xtol being a particularly notable example, probably why Kay is asking. C-41 replenishment for home use, I'm not sure is going to be super viable. Maybe for community darkrooms and the like, especially when you start looking at things like the Ago processor, where you can do huge volume processing with rotary processing for a pretty good price, or even just in a very large tank by hand. You can start looking at larger volumes where it's easier to justify replenishment, but you still need to be constantly churning out film for that to be viable. I don't think that's worth it for someone who buys a kit every 3 or 4 months and develops their last few months worth of film.
Yeah.
And like Brendan said, the closest thing we kind of have is the Bellini monopart developer, where you can just develop 12 rolls, keep the bleach and fix. That's why I had them lying around that I talked about earlier. I think I have 3 of each downstairs that are in various states of aged. Throw away the developer when it's dead and buy fresh developer. And to an extent, that does also increase the economy of the kit, because you can buy the super strength bleach and fix as part of a kit and then get more out of them later, and also separate your batches of development in time and have the later rolls be developed still with fresh chemicals.
Yeah. I will do 1 or 2 more questions if people have them. Get them in. We're going to knock this on the head now in a couple of minutes. Just to be fair to everybody and with their time and everything. Callum, again, with any comments regarding DIY bicarbonate ramjet remover mix affecting developer? You're into the ECN side of things here with removing your ramjet. If you are cross-processing your ECN2 film in a C-41 kit, that's, it's a nice look. And I think there's plenty of the ECN2 film out there at the moment. What's it doing to the developer? When I've done it, I just more or less developed it as normal, removed the ramjet, developed it as normal, and vowed never to bother my bum again.
If you're concerned about the bicarbonate solution, I know this isn't C-41, but I'll just say quickly, if you're concerned about that changing the pH of your developer in a negative way, just rinse it thoroughly. Or if you can, tune the concentration of your bicarb so the pH of your remjet remover matches the pH of the developer within reason to minimize the effect. Beyond that, there's not much I could recommend. It's not something I do at home. I use pre-made remjet remover.
I'd be marking that kit as my ECN2/C41 kit, and I wouldn't be using it for my C41 stuff. It's like the souping, it's I put this through my dishwasher, or I soaked it in a glass of red wine, or this type of stuff. The experimental stuff, it's great, it's absolutely fantastic. But if you're shooting a roll of Portra 800, and you're also removing the ramjet and worried about your bicarb, you're into a whole other end of things. Probably worth very, very briefly touching on that while I think of it, Alex. The 800 ISO film versus 400 versus 200 in the standard.
Of course. Okay. I mentioned at various points that we mentioned the different kits have different capacities in terms of the number of rolls you can develop, and that's usually stated per liter of the solution, regardless of the size of the kit. Something that very few kits touch on, but one of the main ones is the Fuji kit, the Fuji Hunt Express, is that higher ISO films. So we mentioned the developers are reusable and you use a little bit of their power each time you use them and they get a bit weaker. Higher speed films age the developers more rapidly. So if you could develop, for example, 16 ISO 100 films in a liter of whatever developing kit, it doesn't make a difference which one, and then you start developing Portra 800 in the same kit, so 800 versus 100 speed, you will get fewer rolls out of that kit before you see a certain amount of color shift or a certain amount of degradation of the quality of your results. It's hard to quantify this without doing things like control strips, but if you personally see good results up to 15 rolls at ISO 100, you might only see good results up to 8 or 10 rolls at ISO 800 film. And the thing people don't really talk about is that 400 and up is pretty much where this starts. Portra 400, Ultramax, Ilford XP2, black and white C41 film. They're all very, very common. If it were 800 and up, you could kind of disregard it for the most part. But a lot of people shoot a lot of 400 speed film. And that's something you need to factor in that a lot of people really don't.
Yeah. Alex, thank you very much for your time. We didn't even get to touch on your brush with fame and fortune in Germany over the weekend. I'd encourage people to pop onto your stories and threads for the last couple of days. We'd encourage people to get in touch with us and tell us what they would like to hear us talk about again. We're already discussing that we'll probably do this again, mostly because myself and Alex enjoy it, and it means we take a bit of a deeper dive on some of this stuff. And the world writ large deserve to hear about it rather than just the two of us sitting in a coffee shop.
Absolutely. And of course, we have our own list of ideas we've shared between ourselves, the things we want to talk about. But even if you tell us something that we've already come up with, the more people tell us what they want to know, we know what's more relevant and what's going to be more popular, more useful to you who are looking at these live streams with us.
Yeah.
Who might actually get the most value out of it. For all we know, one of our favorite topics we want to talk about is the most boring nonsense to the majority of you, in which case we could put that on the long end and talk about something you're going to find more interesting.
We're honing in on figured out what's the best shutter speed. Alex, have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much, everybody that joined us. Please, if you discovered us through Alex's feed, pop along and maybe give us a follow. And likewise, if you're following ThePhotoShop, please pop along and have a look at what Alex is up to. Go and have a look at his long-running series on Harman. There is some stuff in there which is a deeper dive than anybody ever needed to take on some of this stuff. It's unbelievably fascinating and really worth the effort, and I think it deserves a much bigger audience than it has for something that's so interesting. We will leave it there.
Yes.
Happy enough, Alex?
Thank you very much for having me once again.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you liked this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.